to join us. I think this will be a relatively brief meeting, but I call the meeting to order of the Community Service Associates, Inc. Carolyn, can you confirm that we have a quorum? I appreciate that. We've got a couple updates for the board and for the community that have chosen to join us both in person and on webinar. Michael's going to talk about the search for the new CSA president, and he's also going to talk about what's going on with the nominating committee for the CSA board candidates that will be elected this fall. So I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Mark. When Mark notified me that Brett had plans to move onward with my 20+ years of retained search firm, I started looking at what do we have to do next. And so Brett and I met and worked on the job description and made some modifications to the job description that we lured him to what the job is actually all about. So we had to make some changes to that specifications. And then I activated some of my friends back in Texas from my research firm, my retained search firm. And over the course of the last probably 3 to 4 weeks, we've looked at jobs that would be comparable to what this job is going forward. We have some primary requirements and we have some secondary requirements. One of them is that I think would be very helpful for our new president to have had some experience working with the waterways of the Atlantic Ocean. The executive committee of this board runs or is involved with the beach trust, so we have issues with beach walkways, with high tides, low tides, hurricanes, et cetera, et cetera. As a result of that, over the last couple of weeks, I've identified over 200 county managers, deputy county managers, city managers, and assistant city managers from the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Last Thursday and Friday, I was in Orlando at the Florida League of Cities annual meeting, where I interviewed a number of candidates down there as well. To date, we have identified 217. Some of those are local or within driving distance, and some of those are out of state. I've personally spoken with 38 individuals out of those 217, interviewed 15 of those, and we have 5 that are still being processed that have not been seen eyeball to eyeball going forward. We do have a couple of candidates coming in later this week that the CSA Executive Committee will interview going forward, and then at least 3 more that we will bring in the next couple of weeks going forward. It is virtually impossible to touch base with 217 individuals and do an interview over the phone and get it done before Brett hits Medicare age. So as a result of that, in addition, as some of you realize, we did use Hydrogen Struggles, a nationally known, internationally known retained search firm 5 years ago when we brought Brett in. I've been in touch with the consultant from that, and they are available to us if we want to go that direction. I personally don't think we need to go that way. I think we have a much better handle on the job today than what we did 5 years ago, because 5 years ago, many of us were just in our first year on the board, and we have a little bit better understanding. We are bringing in 2 retained search firms, however, to also meet with the executive committee that will not be near the pricing that we had before with Hydrogen Struggles. So hopefully what we're going to be able to do is find someone in the next couple of weeks that would be able to come on board. Most of these individuals are under some degree of contract with their current employer, be it the county or being the city. These require some places 60 days, some 90 days. Our goal is to try to work our way through the list of people that we have already interviewed or people who have expressed interest but have not been available for me to interview at this time going forward. At some point in time, though, the executive committee will make a decision that we just don't have the time to get through everybody, or we just haven't found the right person. And at that point in time, we would probably move forward with an outside search firm, but we're going to try to avoid that at all costs going forward. The next thing on my agenda is the nominating committee. Let me just make one other comment. I'm surprised a little bit in talking to these people. You leave it the opportunity for them to ask questions of of me. What is it about sea pines? Why should I look at sea pines? And tell me more about sea pines. I expected a few people to ask me the question, what the hell is going on in sea pines? I understand you got some difficulties with getting money. There are people that are very knowledgeable about what's going on inside our gates. What surprised me the most was that some of the individuals that I have spoken to in state that live nowhere close to sea pines asked me that same question. So we have people that are talking about the issues to neighbors, cousins, whatever it might be, but there are people beyond the gates of the town of Hilton Head and beyond the gates of Beaufort County that are aware of sea pines and some of its issues. I don't know how many of those people have deliberately decided not to move forward with it because they don't want to be involved, but it's a factor out there that I didn't anticipate on the big picture. The other thing is the nominating committee, and as of today, the nominating committee, Stu Rodman and Barry Barth and myself for the CSA board completed our last candidate interview today. We will be meeting to determine those candidates that we feel are qualified. I believe we have to have that to the public by by September 1, August 31st, I'm sorry, end of the month. And I anticipate we'll probably have that list out, if not the latter part of this week, the first part of next week. That concludes my report.
Good. I think you indicated that there's 6 to 8 candidates being considered.
Right now, we're processing 5. We have 2
Okay.
coming in on Thursday and 3 more for sure. There may be some others.
And I would say to the board and the residents are here that I think it's a credit to Brett's character. He came to me, I think it was in August, and said, I've been here July, April. I knew it some time ago. I've been here for headed on 5 years. When y'all hired me, I said that it wasn't going to be forever, and it's not going to be forever. I don't have any particular time frame in mind. He's looking to, I believe, go west, looking for a business investment opportunity, and we're in very constant contact. I think we're ahead of the game. My hope is that we find a candidate and can secure that candidate and allow that individual to come on board and serve alongside Brett for some period of time before Brett finds his opportunity. But he's been very open with the executive committee, and we do appreciate it, Brett. Thanks. Okay, with that, we'll move on. We're going to adjourn for a few minutes into an executive session to discuss some legal matters. How long do you think we'll be? Okay. Okay. And as soon as that's concluded, we'll come back and carry on with the balance of the agenda. Thanks. Does, again, to our residents that have joined the meeting, I appreciate your patience. I personally don't like these executive sessions because they cause you all to sit here while we're in the room. There's been a suggestion, and I think this probably works. I want Brett to look at this strategy. But if we post our agenda and we put the very first thing, we call a meeting to order, and we at 3 o'clock or 2:45. We have an executive session, and then we come out of executive session, which means the residents don't have to show up until 3 o'clock. Okay? That way they don't show up and sit, which if I were them, I would find annoying. And it could be 20 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on the content.
The only requirement is if an action's taken, it has to be done in open session. So
Of course.
it's not an executive session. So executive session, if you don't have an action, can be whenever you want it.
Okay.
You call a board member, go to executive session, come back out and take an action on it, but with no action.
Correct. Okay. So we're going to make some changes to that end. Secondly, just so you know why we went into that room, we are a party to 5 legal actions. Either we're a plaintiff or a defendant, and Victoria and Brett were giving the board an update on the status of those cases. So that's what the executive session was about, and there is no action that's required of this board at this time. It was strictly for information purposes. Okay, let's go on. The real purpose of this meeting is to talk about and receive approval to move forward on how do we as a board in this community deal with funding its critical needs going forward in light of the 72% mandate that we've got from 80% of our residents that supported what we've been up to. It's a very difficult high. I don't know what Charles was thinking about when he wrote a 75% threshold while he had a veto power. I mean, it seems like belt and suspenders, but be it as it may, that is what it is. So we're going to talk about, and then there'll be a resolution before the board in terms of the strategy moving forward. Amanda, I think you have a slide that lays out the various considerations, objections that we have been working with over the last few weeks. We've had 2 board workshops. We've had a finance committee meet to vet some of the results of those workshops. But the things that have been looked at and considered, you want to go ahead? Well, you're right, it's almost a month. Well, I just talked about that. We had the most incredible turnout in terms of participation, which is 80% of the ballots that were mailed. I mean, that's a incredible response rate. I mean, I think the largest turnout on an annual election of officers or directors was maybe in the high 37% range. So 80% of these residents participating, or you residents participating, was fantastic. And 3,039, that's 3 out of every 4 residents that could vote were supportive, which in my mind says there's a mandate that we've got some issues out here that we need to get taken care of. Thus, we're having the discussions that we're having today. The considerations and the feedback that came from various different places that gave people reasons not to support was some of this community believes the resort should be paying 1%. And I'm not going to go into debating whether this is accurate or inaccurate. These are just the things that we see out there that cause 28% of this community not to support. Weekly rental, where if you rent your property through the Sea Pines Resort, your rental guests don't pay a gate fee. If you rent your property as a VRBO member or through one of the other outside rental companies, your vacation rental visitors pay a fee. I think it's $17 now. There's inequity there. We understand that. But I think that has given some reason for people not to vote in support of this past referendum. Real estate transfer fee, that was on the original proposal. We did pull that off. I don't think that's something that caused this referendum not to succeed, but it's something that people have some very serious views on. Equitable assessment. Everybody pays residentially, we pay the same assessment regardless of the value of our property. That's the way the covenants are written. But that gave people some concern as to, I have a $300,000 condo and you have a $4 million home, and why are we paying the same thing? Well, that's the way those covenants were written by Charles Frazier 50, 60 years, or 1974, I guess. Special tax district, you're going to hear more about that. That is, we believe, a mechanism by which we can solve some of the financial concerns. A new referendum could potentially solve some of our financial concerns. The gallery shops, which has been tagged as something that it is not, but it gave people reason not to support. Additional rooms at Harbortown is out there. Sunsetting clause, which is you've got a 7-year plan, you ask for this money, so at the end of 7 years it should go away, which in my mind is completely silly, because you paint your house and 5 years later you have to paint it again. Your roof doesn't last forever. The issues and the concerns we have with infrastructure, although there's a 7-year plan, don't go away at the end of 7 years. So sunset clause was a concern. Beach club and pool access, that's been a concern and consideration. And there probably will be others that we will identify as we move through this process. But those are topics and considerations that have been on the table with we board members and staff in looking at where we go forward. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Stu to discuss where he and his committee are in terms of the tax district and a future referendum.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay. Mr. Chairman, coming out of the workshop, you asked that the Finance Committee take a look at the concept of the special tax district. We did debate it, and is that what I've got to click? I'm not real high tech. But in any event, the Finance Committee did try to understand it, understand the various features, debate options within it, and does recommend to the board that we should proceed with that, recognizing that there's still a few things to analyze. Subsequent to that, there was some discussion about how do we make sure we include the whole community. So that particular piece has been added subsequent to the Finance Committee meeting. So in my mind, the referendum didn't fail, it just didn't pass as we look at it. So that puts us to Plan B. Next slide. This is a little overview for you of what the plantation looks like, and it takes a snapshot of the assessed value or the appraised value of all the properties in Sea Pines. And it compares, actually, we just went through a reassessment at the county level. So it looks at what was it before as 16 and what was it afterwards as 18. So the boxes on the big one on the left-hand side is the number of units within Sea Pines. And you can see residential, condos, and then of course commercial for the values. Then we have what we call in South Carolina the 6% and 4% ratio. If you're not familiar with it, basically it takes the appraised value of your property. If you're a resident, it's a primary residence, it's multiplied by 4%. If you're a second homeowner, it's multiplied by 6%. That gets to the assessed value, millages applied to that. That's what shows up on your tax bill. And there is a difference, obviously, between the 4 and the 6s. So just remember, the 4% is the primary residence. You can see there's around 6,000 properties in total. There's a few there that would not fall in the voting, for example, the slip owners. The box on the right-hand side is the appraised value, and if you just look at the 2018 column, and you can see what the values are, and that's in billions of dollars. A little about 5.3 billion is the total appraised value of the real property in Sea Pines. And so actually, as you look at the amount of money we're talking about it, whether it's referendum or special tax district, it's a very small percentage of the assessed or the appraised value of all of our properties put together. And the commercial interest, including the resort, are about 5%. So the residential interests are about 95% of the appraised value of all the properties in Sea Pines. And one interesting thing, the little box on the right-hand side at the bottom, you could see, and that's in millions of dollars, but you could see what the changes were from the prior assessment to the one that was just finished. Now, they're done on 5 years, so it's not really a 2-year, it's more like a 5-year for most of the properties. But even so, the non-residential properties, went up 28%, the second homeowners, and the residential properties, for all practical purposes, stayed flat. I'm not sure what the reason for that was, but they did in fact stay flat between the two assessments. So, and by the way, there's about 2,000 primary residence units in Sea Pines. So an order of magnitude is about 4,000 voters, assuming there's an average of 2,000 voters per property. Next slide, please. Yeah, assuming 2. Okay, so the strategy kind of goes like this. We believe that the expenditure plan that was put in place is a good one, and we should continue that plan as is. In fact, all through the referendum, there really wasn't any disagreement of any of the parties that I'm aware of that said it's not a good expenditure plan. The real issue was other issues, and particularly how do we get the revenues to do that? So the thought process is, from a strategic standpoint, is that if we do the special tax district, let's try to make it as close as we can to what would have been collected as part of the referendum had it passed in full. So that was the underlying thing that the Finance Committee thought made some sense. So what does that mean? Well, clearly the commercial interests and the resort interests, they're willing to continue at the same level that was put forward in that. So for the residential, we're going to try to keep that the same as we can. And interestingly, about 1/3 of our properties are primary homeowners, about 1/3 are second homeowners, and about 1/3 is what I would call investors. And as part of this, you'll see at the end, we really want to make sure that everybody has a say in how we do this. Next slide. Okay, this is just to compare what the voting mechanism is if we do the special tax district. So on the left-hand side, with the covenants and the referendum, with what we just went through in very round numbers, 5,200 were eligible to vote, 80% turnout, needed 75% to pass it. So that means we would have needed 3,200 property owners to pass it. And we obviously came up 100 and change short. Now, if we do a special tax district, the only people that can vote are those that are registered voters. So we probably have about 4,000 registered voters living in Sea Pines. Same 80% turnout, but you only need a 50% to actually put that in place. So to pass it would be 1,600. And if you assume that many couples would vote together, you're really dealing with about 800 couples. Now, in order to put it in place, it has to be a petition to the county to conduct the election. And that has to be 15% of the voters in the area. So that would be about 600 people or 300 couples that would have to sign a petition. Not that they were in favor of the tax district, but they would be in favor of conducting the election to see if we were going to have a tax district. Next slide, please. Okay, this is kind of trying to look at what the numbers might look like to try to match what was in the referendum. So in the left-hand column, the original plan in the referendum was to build up to 450 a year with a 3-year phase-in. 150, 300, 450, and then stay at 450 thereafter. With the tax district piece in trying to mirror that, we're actually past the point where we would collect the taxes in the first year. So if that rolled to the second year, then you'd have the 150 from the first year, the 300 from the second year, would bring it to the same point. And so the first year would be 900. And interestingly, the Alliance folks have put forward their thought on what might work in a referendum. And interestingly, their first 3 years total up to the same amount of 900 in the first 3 years. The big difference is that in the case of the referendum or the tax district, it would continue at the 450 as opposed to in the unity referendum dropping back to the 150. And the difference on that is at the 450 level, we would collect about $3 million a year versus at the 150 level, it would be about $1 million a year. So there's a $2 million difference. Multiply that by 10, 15 years, and you're dealing with $20 or $30 million in total. Now, the other, where the Alliance makes up part of the difference is to say that the resorts guests for the places that they rent, they should pay the same weekly. We're not going to go into that today, but that's part of the issue. That's be part of the makeup. So in other words, this does try to, if we do this, to try to match what was in the referendum that 70-odd% of the people thought made sense. Next slide. Okay, what are the advantages? Well, one, mirroring the referendum. Secondly, I think it's a fairly straightforward process to do a petition and have the county conduct an election. It's very, very easily administered because essentially it goes on the tax bill and the money is sent to CSA. We don't really have to do much of anything. And lastly, and this is maybe just my opinion, but I do believe if we have this in place and we've kind of got our financial house in order, then I think the future referendums, such as the hotel referendum, become a lot easier to do at that point in time. Because as Mark said, a lot of the issues CSA was kind of caught in the middle. There were issues that the Alliance had with other parties that we could do nothing about. So if we solve the revenue side of the equation, then I think the other issues can come forward, and I think it actually improves the opportunity. And if we have this in place and can come up with a better referendum, so much the better. So it provides some options going forward. Now, the disadvantage, if we only did the tax district, is we start to bypass the property owners that are not full-time residents, and you'll see how we hopefully will address that. But the counter argument to that is that same dollar amount approved by a large number of the people. And just a side comment, I think over time, before I got involved, but there were a couple times that Sea Pines actually looked at doing something called a tax district. One, I think, was actually a municipal tax district, was different, required some kind of legislation. I think the other one was kind of a large borrowing. But in any event, what we're talking about here is different than what has been looked at in the past. Next slide. Okay, so if we were to do this, the schedule of putting the tax district in place by itself, again, by the referendum, by the residents, got to do a petition. The county council then takes the petition and confirms that there's a right number of voters, and then they conduct a special election. And once that is done, then the county council actually has to create what we call an ordinance or a statute to actually codify it going forward. That's pretty much a formality at that point in time. Now, if we just put the mechanism in place and then say we're going to allow all of the property owners to then have a say in what is the amount that we elect to, if you will, tax ourselves, obviously we would start with recommendations from the staff, roll it to the board. We could debate it as a community. We can conduct a referendum. But again, in this particular case, it would be the 50, not the 75% that would be required. You got to get it done by about September in order to go on the tax bill so that the money can come in January. So that's kind of the schedule that we kind of deal with. And so each of them is probably a 5 or 6 month cycle. And second one could be done concurrently, or it could be done subsequently. I think we'd probably do it subsequently if we were to go forward this fall with the tax district. Next. I want to make sure that we don't do anything that violates any kind of legal action. So the county attorney is Tom Kevaney. We do this at the county quite a bit anyway, and it's done widely across South Carolina. They don't have a problem with it. He spoke with Josh Gruber, who was the prior county administrator and is now the assistant manager at the town of Hilton Head. And he's an attorney, and he believes that it works without any problem. In fact, it really seems to fit the statute the way it's designed. And as I said, there's a large number of these. They range from small utilities all the way up to the Charleston airport and those types of authorities that are put in place. And they would pose the question, if this doesn't meet the purpose, then what is the purpose of a special tax district? Because this would have seemed to fit this. Now, to make sure we've done the right thing, it's a very competent attorney, Curtis Coltrane, who's here, and CSA has retained him to take a look at it and make sure we're not missing something. And of course, we wouldn't do something if we were missing something. And he just wants to make sure that we're not violating any kind of a provision in the state constitution that would say you can't spend tax money on private interests. We know that. But of course, the money we'd be spending would have been collected from ourselves. So for example, if somebody was to challenge this, they might say, I'm just not saying this would happen, and it's pretty remote, but say, okay, you collected a tax, you're going to spend the money on roads, therefore we can come into Sea Pines and you can't stop us, and we have access. So there may be, we want to maybe be kind of prudent about where we would actually designate where these monies go. The simplest one on the surface would seem to be make it for public safety. We have about a $4 million public safety budget. If we're collecting $3 million there, then it frees up the rest of the budget for all the other stuff that we want to do. So next slide. Some comments have come about we got to be careful and not have government intruding into our activities and cash flow stream. Actually, the county would have, other than authorizing the tax district, conducting the election, has nothing to do with this. This all flows through the treasurer's office, and the treasurer is like the bank of the county. And you can see, you know, they collect 360 or whatever it is million on the tax bills, but they're also the depository for a large amount of other money state, local, impact fees, all other kinds of things that are collected and flow through them. For example, all the money for the airport expansion, probably 30, 40 million, all that would have flown from the federal government, FAA, through the treasurer's office for the work on the airport. And in terms of where do the disbursements go? Well, they have about 45 different accounts, and that includes the county, school district, all the municipalities, and so on down the line. And so in our particular case, as a tax district, that money would come from the treasurer directly to CSA, and there's no way it can be intercepted by those evil people on county council. Next slide. So lastly, I think the recommendation, Mark, Mr. Chairman, for the Finance Committee, with the one modification about being sensitive to the letting everybody have a say in it, is that we ought to go ahead and establish the special tax district. In the course of doing that, we would all see what would be the terms of it going forward. So it creates the mechanism in order to do that. And then subsequently to that, we would decide what is the amount, and then hopefully in this particular case would be mirror the referendum. And by doing that, we've addressed the issue, which seems to be the biggest issue that anybody had, which was if we don't consider the second homeowners, then we've got taxation without representation. And we also can design it so that we can periodically vote as a community on what we want that rate to be. So hopefully that provides an overview, and happy to open up for any board discussion, and then later, if you want to, Mark, questions from the community.
Stu. Carolyn?
When will we get $1 spent?
Yeah, I think it'll be January of 21.
21.
Now, you could actually have a special tax. In other words, if we put it in place in the fall of 19, there could be a special tax bill that would go out for collection just for us for that first 150.
But realistically, it's January 21.
Really, it's January. And as long as we know it's coming, it doesn't stop CSA from doing anything that it wants to do.
Right.
So do you answer your question, January of 21?
Other questions for Stu?
Stu, as you know, I am a proponent of trying to work with a referendum if that's at all possible. If we proceeded down this path, is there anything that would mean that we couldn't do a referendum if we had this in place?
I don't think so. In fact, I think it actually would enhance the discussion about if we had this in place as either an option, an alternative referendum could be looked at, or an alternative referendum could be done in lieu of this. Now, I frankly think that if we did this, what you'd probably end up with is keeping the tax district, but you could still have the referendum on the balance of the features. You just would have eliminated the controversy over the collection of the residential assessment.
Larry?
Thanks. I think it's important, Stu, because as a member of the Finance Committee and also having sat on a number of the board workshops, that we also recognize that we looked at a lot of things here. We I think appropriately have a fiduciary duty to respond to the 72%. In addition to the alliance, even the unity referendum that acknowledges that we have needs and we have to raise the money, and we're raising, at least in the first 3 years, the exact same amount of money. We looked at an awful lot of ways to raise the money. We looked at putting fees on things that we don't currently charge for. We looked at potentially having a fund where people could contribute voluntarily. And we're looking at the special tax district. I think it's also important to note that this is not necessarily in stone, because we still the staff has to do a lot of investigation. I think we also, the one issue that unfortunately, social media has already started attacking the idea even before the facts are out there. We can't stop that. But I think it's important on the taxation without representation to recognize that if we do in fact raise the exact same amount of money as we were planning to raise in the referendum, with 80% of our community voting, which I think we should be very proud of, and 72% supporting it, it's hard, it seems to me it's hard to make an argument that the non-residents who may not have a right to vote this time will not have a substantial number, if not a substantial majority, will not have voiced their opinion that we want to raise the money and we want to raise that at 450. So I think while I know we'll be attacked on this, I think the community needs to remember that we've had a vote. This isn't being done, unlike most things in South Carolina, where non-residents don't get to vote on taxes. This time, the amount of money that's being raised has been voted on, and with an overwhelming majority. I also think it's important to note that a lot of the objections that Mark discussed don't go to the heart of the funding or the amount of the funding. As you noted, virtually all the folks that we've seen have supported the amount of funding, and certainly an overwhelming majority have. And so while we do need, as Charlie said, we'll probably need to have a referendum to resolve some of those other issues if we can. If we do this special tax district and we had an election, we ought to keep in mind that the issues that were raised, beach parking, the fairness of gate passes, pool access, I can't even remember the list of things that were raised as objections that caused no votes. Almost none of them related to the need for funding and the amount of funding. And so as we're going forward, if we in fact only poll the residents and we only need 50.1%, I think it's fair to say we are meeting our fiduciary responsibility to satisfy the needs of the community as voiced in that referendum.
Further questions of Stu from the board? We all good?
I just have one more comment, and I think it goes along with what Larry was saying. I've kind of spent the last couple weeks making sure that I'm chatting with people that are non-residents. I know when I was a non-resident, I've been a resident full-time now for a little over 4 years, but was a non-resident for 11 years. And I had a real beef with the issue of paying the taxes, that I was paying for a villa. And that villa was basically ended up being comparable to the taxes I pay on my home right now. And I know the sensitivity level of that. And so I've kind of purposely raised that issue. Normally I don't like people yelling at me, but I would purposely just kind of chat with them about it just to see how they react to it. And most of them had the first reaction we all have, taxation without representation. So I think the one thing that I feel a lot more comfortable if we were to go this route is the equity position that's been in place with mirroring what was the referendum before in terms of the dollar amount, rather than going the ad valorem route, which would be tied to property value issues. And so I would say at this point, I think it's important, for us to explore this as we're talking about today, but also a referendum, even though the challenge of passing a referendum is, I don't want to say insurmountable, but it is really a challenge. But the one thing we can do, though, is capture some of these other issues that people maybe haven't been able to agree on, or that have been trailing issues in the past that going forward really need to be resolved. I think all of us want to bring this community together, and it's just critical that we find ways to do that. And it might be a multi-step process. And this is certainly a step in the right direction.
Well, Barry, I think as you know, and I know Stu has mentioned, the idea here is how to overcome that concept of not having representation is to have a periodic reset. I mean, if you go 0, 450, so you got 3 years of 900, and we know exactly how much money that is and exactly what it's going to, and it's not going to the Galleria shops, it's going to paving, it's going to drainage, it's going to tree care. And maybe you incorporate public safety and we pick up some allocation for that. That number doesn't last forever. And if you take the future budget to the community to support at a 50% level, right? Or do you do this as a referendum? 50% level. But you ask that here's what we need to spend for the next 3 years, 5 years. You're having a reset. People are getting to take a look at it. So there is representation in my mind. Anyway, any other further questions for Stu? Right. All right, we've got two business resolutions that I need to put before you. The first one is which one is it, Amanda? 6A, 6B? 6B, I'll read it and then I'll ask for a motion. Resolve Community Service Associates Board of Directors ratifies the vote on approval of a landscape maintenance contract between Community Service Associates Inc. and Bright View Landscape Services Incorporated. The contract to be in effect November 1, 2019 through October 31, 2022, and to include two subsequent one-year renewal options for 2022 and 23 as finalized previously by an email vote. May I have a motion? Is there a second? Any discussion on this topic? All in favor? Anyone opposed? Abstain? Thank you. Next resolution reads as follows, and again, I'll entertain a motion. Resolved, Community Service Associates Inc. Board of Directors directs CSA staff to work with the CSA Finance Committee Chairman and the CSA Finance Committee to investigate the feasibility of a special tax district to address our critical community funding needs, as well as to investigate a new referendum for other funding and other actions for the improvement of CPINs. Motion? Or discussion? You'll move. And I have a second. Discussion.
Just could we add in there, I don't have the writing in front of me, at the funding levels, for at least for the first 3 years, consistent with the referendum, so that it is clear that that is exactly what we're asking for? Thank you. I'll make the motion to amend my motion.
All in favor of that amendment? Any opposed? Okay, is there any discussion on the amended resolution or motion? I'll take a vote. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstain? Somebody say aye. Did he say, Bill, aye to what? Thank you. Okay, that I think concludes. I'll open up the floor to the board if any of you have any comments or questions of staff. Again, I appreciate you all giving us your time this afternoon. Anyone? Entertain a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Up. Yes. Yes. Have you ever been to a meeting before? I always do. We always adjourn the meeting and then we open the floor for public questions. And every meeting I've been a party to in the last 6 years, that's what we've done. So I'm not trying to offend anybody. Okay, so we are adjourned and I'll now entertain questions or comments. Hopefully they're questions. It is. Hopefully these are questions. Where should we begin? You must have a question.
I can speak loud enough, I think. No,
I'm sorry. One logistic comment. If you do get the microphone, if you want this to be captured on the webinar, nobody will hear you if you don't have a mic. So please make sure that you speak clearly into the microphone so we can have a good video afterwards for you guys. So just a logistic. And please identify yourselves.
Tom Coleman, 71 Wood Duck Road. One of the factors that was mentioned that people may have resorted to in voting against the referendum was a gallery of shops. I'd like an update on where does that stand and what are the plans for the future?
Well, currently, we own that property, and it is cost us roughly $1 million for 50, 80, something like that. And we are trimming the hedges and blowing the roof, and actually, it looks better today than it did when we acquired the property. But power is still on. Because if we demo the building, it is non-conforming under the current LMO. And if you demo the building, you only have 18 months to be able to retain the rights the property currently has. We don't have the necessary funding to go forward with the project that had previously been contemplated.
That's because the referendum was voted down?
Correct. So we are, and we talked about this as recently as this morning in a workshop, we are going to go to the town and ask, I guess it goes through zoning and appeals, for relief from that 18-month period of time in exchange for agreeing to demo that horrible looking property. We believe and are confident that we have a property that is worth exactly, or if not more than what we paid for it. We'd just like to get that eyesore out of the way. And when we arrive at a place where we have the proper funding, there may be a future development there that benefits Sea Pine community. We're also rolling out the ABDI system for pass management and pass issuance that some believe, and they may be right, that will have a material impact on how you call in your gate passes and how visitors receive gate passes. And that may have an impact on just exactly what needs to happen out there. So it's on hold, and it's on hold for a variety of reasons.
So it's a work in progress. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. Okay. Thanks. I think we have one back here.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Herbert at 2 Muirfield. I have a series of questions. The first is, do you have a written procedure for the conduct of your meetings? I have looked on your website, I cannot find it. And that it troubles me that you go into executive session and there is no provision that I can find authorizing that. And I do know that that can create some problems with regard to action subsequently taken.
Well, I think,
and I don't understand why you should go into executive session when you have no provision authorizing it, other than, oh, we used to do it, just like in Fiddler on the Roof.
understand.
Is there an answer to my question?
Well, I don't know that there's any published policy and procedure. Every board that I've ever sat on, and I've sat on plenty, very often have executive sessions. And I don't think it's an unusual activity to have.
I have represented a lot of boards, and we always have a written procedure for that.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Mark, there is no procedure for meetings. However, in the bylaws, you'll note that there is a provision that if room is available for board meetings, we will open those to the membership and provide that in that. So there's no requirement to have a public meeting, other than we have said that we would do that in the bylaws. And that's on a space available basis. That's the only reference I know of in the bylaws to meetings, other than what would be in the Nonprofit Act that requires an annual meeting.
So the bylaws then provide, the bylaws give us the right to be here, and there was clearly sufficient space available for your meeting that you just had. But my next question relates to the special taxing, or series of questions relates to the special taxing district. And I don't want you to assume that I am against the need for funding or critical of the proposed uses of those funds. I simply don't know. Down the road, I might be critical, but nonetheless, right now, I would like to ask you if you have a memorandum from council analyzing the effect or the feasibility of adopting a special taxing district.
There,
And if so, I would like to have a copy of it.
there's not such a memorandum. We've initiated discussion with the county attorney. We've talked to 2 different counsel on the feasibility of doing this. The purpose of this meeting was to discuss openly with the board and the community of a direction and give staff direction to proceed to work through all of those considerations, including getting opinions like that you're talking about, so that we can act on this at some future date.
Okay.
Probably the best memo is the state statute, and
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at.
Brett has a copy of that, probably can get that for you. It defines how, you've got it, okay.
I'm assuming that you're going under 4-9-30. Is that correct? Where do you get the assumption that the taxing authority simply turns the money over to you for use? Because I'm not licensed in this state, but I don't think it's rocket science to look at this statute and conclude that the county council is going to control that money. The county council will either determine how it's spent through or administer its expenditures through a separate department of county government, or create a separate commission, and the council itself appoint the members of that commission, who in turn will receive the money and determine how it's spent. And those members won't necessarily be CSA board members or Sea Pines residents or whatever. And that is troubling, because what it means is you're asking, we're being asked to trust the government to do right by us, which I have found over 56 years of practicing law is an exercise in stupidity.
To try to answer that, as I said earlier, I don't, the money doesn't pass through the county government other than through the treasurer, that is separately elected, has a fiduciary responsibility, and has a long history of doing this properly. So, and there would be a board or commission appointed, but we would be the ones who would recommend who that is. There's no external body that appoints them. That would be done as part of setting up the district.
That's not what
I think that's a very good question. And it is a question that we are well aware of, and we understand. We have to have complete confidence, like you, that it's not controlled by a county government, and that they collect, they pass to us, and we continue to maintain and manage our community. If it's not that, and we'll know that as we go through this process, then it's something that we're not going to be very supportive of.
Well, the statute clearly says in subsection 6B, I believe it is, the special tax district may be operated as an administrative division of the county. That is a separate.
I probably operative word there's may. I'm not a lawyer, you are, but.
Or county council may appoint a commission.
Understood.
Consisting of 3 to 5 members and provide for their term of office.
I understand. We'll take that under advisement. Anyone further?
I have several questions on the webinar.
Dana.
Hello, I'm Dana Advocate from 55 Deer Run Lane. We've just been through the referendum process, and we've spent an incredible amount of money on promotional materials and advertising and marketing. And you all have just gotten out of a special executive session where you're discussing 5 different legal actions. I'd like to ask Stu what he anticipates as potential legal action if you do pursue a special tax district from the 70% of homeowners that are disenfranchised and not able to vote, and what kind of marketing budget are we going to have to expect for the next round?
Well, and I'll turn this over to Stu because you directed this question to him, but I'll look to Victoria, and I'd like to dispose of this concept that there was an incredible amount of money spent on the pursuit of this referendum. There was a budget item, and we by okay, so if 35 is a number, and you can confirm this at some later date, if $35,000 was a cost of going through several months of production in attempt to get 80% participation and a 72% support, I think that's, Dana, money very well spent. And if we have to spend another $35,000 to accomplish and get the answers as to the viability of a special tax district, I, for one, will be very supportive of us doing that as well.
So I really wouldn't see us spending any significant money. We all know what the issues are, and we can vote it up or down. So I don't see that as being a particular issue. The second part of the question was what again?
So I'm asking if you anticipate any
legal
action from perhaps the 70% of homeowners who won't get to vote.
Okay, well, first of all, what I described is that they actually do get to vote. So they're not disenfranchised. So they don't have a claim there. And I don't see any course of action that somebody would take to, that would have standing to say we're not doing the right thing. You have to challenge the South Carolina statute. And I think that's tough to do.
Actually, I probably should have been clearer. Perhaps some of the people believe that the covenants actually protect their right to vote on how they're taxed. So am I to understand you don't expect any legal action from the 70% of people who have their covenants guaranteeing them a right to vote, and you're circumventing that?
Well, people have a right to vote. They have a right to sue. I'm sorry, they have a right to sue, but state law trumps local law. And so you would have to be suing the state to say that their statute is wrong, that it violates the Constitution. And I don't see that happening.
Yeah, Mark, I just want to add to that. I understand that people have a right to sue, and we all know in America that seems to be the way. If you can get a lot of money for hot coffee in your pocket. I think more importantly, the board has the not fiduciary duty to do what we believe is in the best interest of the community. If we get sued and we lose, then we may have made a mistake, but I'm very confident in this board and the legal judgments that we'll make before we do this, that if we get sued, we won't lose. And we will have done what's in the best interest of the community based on the 72% vote, many of whom are non-residents and who have approved the amount. So I think, Dana, to your point, we may get sued, but I don't think that should be the basis on which we don't act. I think we should act in what we believe is in the best interest of the community. And I think we all believe that if we decide to go with a special tax district because it is legally the right thing to do, it will be because we believe it's in the best interest of the community.
Sorry, one last question, I promise. Which do you think is the safer route? Another referendum, for instance, the unity referendum, maybe modifying that a little bit, or a special tax district?
You know, we've gone through some assessment of the viability of an additional referendum. There were 28% of the community, of the 80% that committed, that did not support this. And if you go through what was it that they didn't support, there are at least, Dana, and you're one of them, entities out there, and I'm saying this kindly, there are 4 different entities that have their own ideas about how life should go forward. And there's not a single referendum in my mind that solves the problems and concerns of each one of those entities. So solving this entity's funding, I don't believe, can occur through another referendum. There are things that we can solve going forward using the referendum mechanism, and we can rally around those things. But solving a $3 million financial hole, I don't believe ever comes from a referendum. And I think the board feels the same way. Linda, you had a question?
My name is Linda Fahrenkopf, 35 Wagon Road, and I'm asking for a friend who's in this position. He owns a dwelling here that is on the long-term rental market. He's had someone in there for several years. And does that person get to vote? Because he does live in Sea Pines and he has the voting.
So if he's a registered voter.
He's a registered voter, but he lives in Sea Pines. He's not a homeowner. That is his concern. Does he gets to vote?
I believe he gets a vote.
Okay, that was my question.
Okay.
Thank you.
You've got some webinar questions, and then I think we'll conclude this.
Okay, test yellow. Okay. So we have some questions from the webinar. The first question from the webinar is from property owner Diane Games. I don't say anything that really addresses the taxation issue for non-residents. As I heard it, the way to change the assessment is still by vote of registered voters only. So more of a comment than a question, I believe. If you'd like to address that, Mark.
Well,
He's on.
I died. Hello? No, that's a detail. And we don't have all of those details yet worked out. We don't want to disenfranchise people unnecessarily. So as we develop this concept, that'll get vetted.
Next question, I'm up on yellow. Next question is from Terry Weiss. Terry Weiss from Widgewood Lane says, please explain the precision on how the special tax district would not disenfranchise non-residents when we would have no right to vote for it. Residents would be able to double up on the votes in their household and non-residents would have no vote. Please explain.
I explained that earlier. I can't answer that question specifically because the logistics of this are not yet on the table for this board to make a determination. That'll happen over the course of the next weeks or months.
Understood. Next question comes from property owner DJ DeLong. What is the cost of the election by the county and who pays for that cost?
It's probably $3,000 or $4,000 and we would have to bear that cost.
Understood. Thanks, Stu. Next question comes from Dana Durham. Do any other Hilton Head Island plantations utilize a special tax district?
I believe that I understand that there are something like 800 of these districts in the state. And I believe I understand that there are 8 of these districts in the county, but none on Hilton Head Island.
Thank you for clarifying. I hope that helps answer your question, Mr. Next question is from Michael Soul. The question is, rental guests and properties not owned by the resort contribute like all of us and our guests to the wear and tear experienced by Sea Pines. If we charged all rental guests the same fee, this would be fair and bring in about $1 million per year and hence markedly decrease the STD charge. Also, it would be fair if the STD charge be ad valorem and in line with property taxes. These questions are to be directed to Stu, please. Sorry. And STD is special tax district. Just as a clarification.
We got to get a different name.
I know, we do. I will figure out a better name. So.
I think the confusion, let me go back to the earlier questions, and maybe you didn't describe it very well, but essentially, the registered voters would be voting to put the mechanism in place, but the property owners would be voting to what the tax rate itself would be. So I don't believe anybody is disenfranchised in what's on the table.
The only change is you need 50%, not 75%.
Right.
No, I agree. It's a big difference.
Yeah.
Okay, just a few more questions from the webinar.
Let me add one. He's absolutely correct that the $17 or $15 fee that a non-resort rental, short-term rental homeowner pays is inequitable. I mean, we have discussed this ex nauseum over the last years. That is a right that our colleagues at the resort and the good ones have. Is it fair? They acknowledge that it gives them an unfair advantage, but we have tried everything that we can, we CSA and Charlie Aspo, to overcome that. And we've not been successful. That's number one. Number two, the calculation that it is a $1 million loss is just not true. The data exists that Victoria, if we were charging and could charge the resort the same $17 that a short-term rental resident pays, would amount to about 530,000. So, just like I scolded, if you will, Dana over the exorbitant cost of administering this referendum, I wish somebody would listen to the facts that we're not compromising $1 million worth of revenue. We're compromising 530, and it's not a compromise because we don't have a right to collect it. Let's go on.
Next.
If I may, I don't think we should say that the resort has acknowledged some inequity in that. I may be wrong, but Steve is not. But I guess the point is we're focusing on that, but the resort has a lot of rights that have to do with the passes and so forth. It's not just this, there's all kind of things. So it's very dangerous to just talk about this particular one, because if you're going to get into a discussion of the rights that the company has, they're vastly bigger than just the passes for the vacation people. So all I'm saying is let's don't let this get out of hand in terms of that right. I mean, that's something that you'd have to sit down with the resort and talk about all the pass rights that they have, because there's a lot more of them than just these rental ones. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple more. Peter Viro from Marsh Island. In regards to the light shed on the issue of allowing low-speed vehicles and sea pines via a survey, why not put forth a survey to the residential property owners as to whether the residential property owner voting population would support a new special tax district for the unity referendum?
And that may well happen. We don't have and have not worked through the specifics in its entirety. Until we have worked through all of those specifics, in my mind, it would be pretty foolish to try to do such a survey. But just like we did prior to holding this referendum, we put out, once we had a base set of terms, we put them out before the community, said, can you support that? Right? And it may well be that would be appropriate to do before we initiate a petition and ask the county to hold an election.
Question from Mr. James Nolan from South Sea Pines Drive. If it is true that a special taxing district is established, non-residents of the state of South Carolina will have no vote. Is this not considered an end around our existing covenants?
Well, I think that was answered earlier. I think Dana brought that to the attention, and I think Stu answered it in appropriately, which there is a state statute and that trumps our covenants.
Thank you. And the last question from the webinar is from Terry Weiss. Terry Weiss is asking, what effort is being made to recover the $540,000 write-off from the town?
Well, I think, Victoria, you might want to expand on this. We haven't given up a right to collect what we firmly believe the town has an obligation to reimburse us for. We took a write-off of that receivable for an accounting purpose.
That's correct. We did not believe that the receivable was collectible. So therefore, in order to be conservative with GAAP, we completely did 100% allowance against that receivable.
Correct.
Sure, we could. Sure, we're still pursuing collection efforts. Absolutely.
One more.
Okay, last question from the webinar is from Deborah. Apologize for my mispronunciation, Zelinki. Selesnik, thank you, Carrie. Deborah's question is it possible to come up with another referendum and put it out knowing if not approved, it would be circumventing the covenants, so you're more likely to get a yes?
Again?
Okay. Is it possible to come up with another referendum and put it out knowing that if that referendum is not approved, it would be circumventing the covenants, so you are more likely to get a yes?
I
referendum?
have no idea what that question
Okay, I tried my best.
means.
Deborah.
I'm sorry.
So sorry. I think that's what she means. I'm trying to dissect this question, but I think
so. What if I'm hearing, hold a referendum surrounding funding and say, if you don't approve of this referendum, we're going to do a tax district. Is that what I think
I think that's correct. Yes, that's what I'm dissecting.
We actually have had conversation about that, and we think it's appropriate if we can get the right terms for a tax district to put in place. It is a vehicle that can be used if we cannot address some of these funding mechanisms through the referendum, a future referendum, right, Stu? Yeah.
Okay. We do have a few questions. It's up to you certainly to call it. We have 3 questions that I can address afterwards, or you can.
Let's follow up with those questions after the fact. It's 20 minutes of 5, and we have one. Go ahead.
Actually, Michael Wolf, Deer Run Lane, most of my questions got asked on the seminar, on the webinar. One question, Mark, to you regarding the gate passes. The moderator of one of the Facebook groups is insistent that his guests don't pay that fee, that he pays it. His argument is then it's a tax on him, and that's not fair. I don't want to comment on that, but it does raise the question. If we did away with the gate fee for weekly guests and instead imposed an appropriate surcharge on residents who rent their homes, which is, I believe, what CSA did prior to about 2006, we could get around the problem of inequitable gate fees or whatever without hurting the resort, because they'd be taken out of the situation, and without reducing CSA's revenue. Has that, among the many things that we have looked at, has that been looked at, and why was it rejected?
It's not.
Well, first, is this working?
Over here.
Okay. I think there are lots of options. Mark and I don't totally agree on whether or not a referendum can be put together that solves enough of our problems so that we're assuring the future of this community. I think we got some work to do on how we do that. I think that question that you just asked relative to the weekly gate passes is part of that equation, something we have to take a look at and see if there's a way around it. We don't know the answer to that yet. These are complicated questions. They all have funding ramifications. If you take that money away, how do you replace it? Does it actually replace them? And what you find is that there are a lot of people who speculate on how much something costs or how much it's going to produce in revenue. And we really have to rely on Victoria and our own staff here to do the evaluation of what these things cost, what the revenues consequences are.
Remind us what the short-term rental pass collections are on an annual basis.
In 2018,
All right, so to equalize the short-term rental community with the resort short-term rental community, CSA would have to give up $830,000 worth of revenue. That's a big hole to fill.
Or find it someplace else, as you suggested.
Yeah.
But I think those are things that need to be looked at.
But if you, hello? Yes, that's a way of shutting me up. If you charge the homeowner whatever it takes to get to $800,000 a year, it becomes revenue neutral.
Understood.
And Mark, I mean, you said we've looked at lots of options.
Yes.
I'm just asking, was that ever
Oh,
looked
we had
at?
a meeting this morning. We talked about something like that, which would also not only include the resident short-term rentals, but the resort short-term rentals.
Exactly.
If you rent your property in Sea Pines, there is a fee assessed to CSA. We've discussed that. And there may be some support for something like that.
Second question with respect to the special tax district.
Yep.
The devil's in the details.
Absolutely.
And looking at the section of the South Carolina Code that we're dependent on, the question becomes, who is the governing body of that new special tax district? And it strikes me as very difficult for the county to simply say it's going to be CSA. The county could theoretically make it 5 residents.
I can't support this if I'm at
just
the beck and call of Beaufort County. No disrespect to Stu.
Clearly, under the law, that's who makes that decision. And I think the board needs to be straightforward about that when they present it to people.
Agreed.
Second question is how, and Stu, I know you tried to explain it in your presentation. How are you going to treat non-residents, investors, and residents in the same way? And how are you going to include the revenue or the tax revenue from the resort and from commercial interest? Because you got to treat everybody under the tax law equally.
The strategy is to try to make everybody pay the same as they would have paid under the referendum. So for example, if the resort is putting in $100 and something thousand that they would have put in, and they have a couple of properties that then get taxed, we would hold them harmless, give them a credit back on that so that they end up at the end of the day paying the exact same thing as they would have paid. In terms of the board, what would happen is we would actually have that all thought out, and when the vote took place, it would say this is how that board would be. But it's clearly not the county setting, and all the county's doing is approving whatever we suggest that we'd like to have. And we obviously want to have our own people be in control of that particular board.
Stuart, with all due respect, the county does set it up. They can tell us when they set it up that they're going to do it the way we like, but there's no guarantee that the next county board is going to agree with them.
Well, it would,
And secondly, while we can try and treat the same revenue stream from everybody, the county can't do that. The county's going to have to treat every property the same way, either on a property basis or an ad valorem basis.
Another good point. We heard you. And we have to work through these details. Stu, this board, Brett, we're not there yet. We got to get there before we put this before the board and direct staff to proceed with creating this district and asking and signing a petition and asking the county to put in place. These questions have to be answered. We know that. So I appreciate your comments.
But if the county establishes an ordinance to put this in place, the county has no right, no ability to violate its own laws to go and take the money. They actually have to live with the ordinance that's been voted on. So there's no way that money can be absconded with.
All right. Again, Sue, last question.
Sue Emke, 33 Governors Road. I've heard a lot about fiduciary duties, and I haven't heard anything about the fiduciary duty of this board to support the covenants. And I feel an STD, and I know we don't like it, is an end around the covenants, that's all you're doing. And that is not your job.
Thanks for your comment. I think that concludes. Appreciate your attention this afternoon. Thank you.